Friends, thank you for being here today. And we find ourselves convening at a moment of profound historical consequence. While the eyes of the world are understandably fixed on the night skies of the Middle East, watching the kinetic and devastating reality of American forces executing Operation Epic Fury against Iranian targets, there is a secondary, quieter, yet equally significant firestorm consuming the capital of our northern neighbor, Ottawa. Canada, a nation whose modern diplomatic identity has been painstakingly built over 8 decades upon a foundation of strict adherence to multilateralism, the United Nations Charter, and international law, has just executed a maneuver that has shocked Washington, bewildered its European allies, and fractured its own domestic political landscape. In an unprecedented move, the Canadian government fully and unconditionally endorsed a unilateral United States military strike. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look past the immediate headlines and ask a fundamental, provocative question. What immense, unseen pressures could compel a Canadian Prime Minister to abandon 80 years of established diplomatic tradition virtually overnight? Furthermore, what does this sudden, stunning capitulation reveal about the stark, impossible choices that are now being forced upon every Western democracy in this new era of transactional geopolitics? Today, we will dissect this geopolitical earthquake not through the lens of sensationalism, but through careful historical context, economic reality, and diplomatic precedent. Let us begin by examining the immediate fallout of this crisis and just how unprecedented Ottawa's endorsement truly was. When the American munitions began falling on Tehran, Isfahan, and other Iranian military and command centers, the immediate reaction from the traditional Western alliance was one of profound, studied caution. We have seen this diplomatic choreography before. In capitals across Europe, leaders, mindful of the historical powder keg that is the Middle East, reached for the language of restraint. In Paris, the French government, drawing on its long-standing tradition of seeking diplomatic mediation, expressed deep concern and urged an immediate return to negotiations. In Berlin, the German government, deeply constrained by its historical aversion to aggressive military posturing, remained conspicuously silent, offering no immediate endorsement. In Madrid, the Spanish government was perhaps the most direct. Their prime minister appeared on national television and stated, without ambiguity, no to war. Most European leaders opted for some version of this cautious distance, attempting to balance their alliance with the United States against their commitment to international legal frameworks that strictly govern the unprovoked use of military force. And then there was Canada. In a stark, jarring contrast to its European peers, the Canadian government, through a joint statement issued by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, released an unambiguous endorsement of the United States operation. They stated clearly that Canada supported the U.S. acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and neutralizing the regime's threat to international peace. It was not a statement burdened with caveats, calls for United Nations Security Council authorization, or appeals for restraint. It was official, written, governmental support for a unilateral military offensive. The glaring contradiction of this moment cannot be overstated. This endorsement did not come from a hawkish, right-wing administration eager for military adventurism. It came from a prime minister who, mere weeks earlier, had stood before the global elite at the World Economic Forum in Davos and delivered a celebrated, passionate defense of the rules-based international order. In that speech, he publicly warned against the dangers of unilateral actions by global hegemons who trample the rights of weaker nations. The hypocrisy was immediate, tangible, and deeply unsettling to observers of global diplomacy. How does the champion of multilateralism transform into the cheerleader for unilateral warfare in the span of a single month? This decision, however, did not happen in a vacuum. To understand its magnitude, we must look at the historical precedent it shatters and the fierce internal rebellion it has ignited. To fully grasp why this endorsement sent shockwaves through the Canadian political establishment, we must contextualize it within modern Canadian history. For those of us who remember the geopolitical climate of 2003, the parallels and contrasts are striking. In 2003, the United States, under President George W. Bush, was building its coalition of the willing to invade Iraq. The pressure on allies to join was immense. Yet, Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien made the deeply controversial, yet historically defining decision to refuse Canadian participation. His reasoning was clear, legally grounded, and principled. The invasion lacked a mandate from the United Nations Security Council. Chrétien absorbed the fury of the Bush administration and the mocking of certain American media outlets. However, that moment is now revered in Canada as a defining assertion of sovereign identity, proof that Canada was not merely an automatic rubber stamp for American foreign policy, but a middle power governed by the rule of international law. The current Prime Minister's decision is the exact inversion of the 2003 precedent. He has chosen to stand with a unilateral American president, where his predecessor chose to stand with the United Nations. This betrayal of precedent ignited an immediate and fierce internal rebellion. spearheaded not by the opposition, but by the intellectual titans of his own political family. Lloyd Axworthy, a highly respected former Foreign Affairs Minister and the very architect of Canada's modern soft power diplomatic identity, the man who championed the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines and the establishment of the International Criminal Court, issued a devastating public critique. Axworthy argued forcefully that endorsing this unilateral strike effectively abandoned Canada's foundational commitment to preventing aggressive war. He accused the government of enabling an imperial presidency, stripping away the moral authority Canada has relied upon for decades. The revolt quickly spread to the current ranks of members of Parliament within the Prime Minister's own ruling coalition. They took to public platforms to highlight a crucial, terrifying paradox. Canada, a nation sharing the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, cannot endorse the unilateral assassination of foreign leaders and the bypassing of international borders, and simultaneously expect that same American administration to respect Canadian sovereignty. It is a legal and moral inconsistency that exposes the nation to profound strategic vulnerability. I want to pause here and ask for your perspective. For those of you who vividly remember the diplomatic climate of 2003, do you view this current reversal in Ottawa as a necessary, pragmatic evolution of realpolitik or a tragic abandonment of principle? Please share your historical perspective in the comments. This is a debate we must have. What followed this internal rebellion was a government in chaos, marked by a complete breakdown of coherent policy. As the domestic backlash intensified, the machinery of the Canadian government began to publicly fracture under the immense pressure, resulting in a breakdown of coherent policy that baffled allies and citizens alike. In the span of a single day, Ottawa managed to broadcast 3 entirely distinct, contradictory foreign policy directives to the world. First, there was the Prime Minister holding the line on his initial statement, expressing fundamental support for the American military strikes and the objective of dismantling the Iranian nuclear apparatus. Second, the Foreign Affairs Minister, clearly feeling the intense heat from the diplomatic corps and the party base, issued a separate, noticeably softer statement. This message functioned as a plea for diplomacy, emphasizing the paramount importance of protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure and urging a return to the negotiating table. Third, and perhaps most startlingly, the defense minister appeared on national television and called for an immediate ceasefire. Consider the strategic incoherence of this posture. A prime minister supporting a war, a foreign minister calling for diplomacy, a defense minister demanding a ceasefire. This is not the behavior of a government operating with a unified strategic vision. It is the symptom of a cabinet in profound distress, attempting to triangulate an impossible political position. For Washington, trying to decipher whether its northern ally is actually reliable, this creates whiplash. For the Canadian public, it demonstrates a government buckling under external pressure, trading its principles for short-term political survival, yet failing to satisfy anyone in the process. We must then ask about the realpolitik calculation at play here, the actual underlying reason behind this stunning capitulation. Why, then, did a prime minister so deeply invested in the rhetoric of the rules-based order willingly walk into this political meat grinder? The answer is not rooted in a sudden conversion to hawkish interventionism. It is rooted in a cold, brutal, and terrifying realpolitik calculation regarding raw economic survival. Canada is, quite literally, an economic hostage. If we examine the economic data, the vulnerability is stark. Canada's economy relies on the United States for roughly 90% of its market access. The supply chains of the North American auto sector, the massive energy grids, the agricultural exports, all of it flows south across a border that the current American administration has repeatedly shown a willingness to weaponize. At the heart of this anxiety is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA or CUSMA in Canada. With this vital trade treaty constantly under threat of arbitrary renegotiation or suspension by a highly transactional U.S. president, the Canadian Prime Minister was forced to make a calculated, albeit crude, decision in the midnight hours as the bombs began to fall. The political cost of enduring domestic outrage and international hypocrisy for endorsing an unauthorized war was ultimately deemed lower than the devastating generational economic cost of a potential U.S. trade embargo. The American administration has established a clear, unmistakable playbook of economic coercion to enforce diplomatic compliance. We have seen how Spain and Great Britain were treated when they initially resisted U.S. military requests for logistical support or airspace usage in this very conflict. They were met with immediate public threats of severe trade embargoes and orchestrated diplomatic humiliation until their resistance crumbled. Canada recognized this template immediately. Unlike Spain or France, Canada has no multilateral shield, no European Union to hide behind. There's only the border, the integrated economy, and the looming threat of tariffs that could wipe out industries in Ontario and Alberta overnight. The Prime Minister traded Canada's diplomatic soul for the maintenance of a trade agreement. This calculation, however, has created an inescapable trap, one that threatens to drag Canada from a mere rhetorical endorsement into active military entanglement. The tragedy of this realpolitik calculation is that it rarely ends with a mere statement of support. By attempting to thread the needle, offering rhetorical support for the war while trying to avoid actual participation, the Canadian government has walked into an inescapable trap. Facing immense domestic outrage over the initial endorsement, the Prime Minister attempted a clumsy walkback. He eventually admitted on the public record in front of international press that the U.S. strikes appear to be inconsistent with international law. This was a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of Canada's traditional commitment to the UN Charter. However, this rhetorical pivot led to a fatal concession. Having just stated the war appeared illegal, a reporter asked the Prime Minister the inevitable follow-up question: would Canada provide military support to the United States in this conflict? The Prime Minister, paralyzed by the fear of provoking Washington, refused to categorically rule out Canadian military participation. Let that sink in. The leader of a G7 nation refused to rule out sending his country's armed forces to participate in a war that he himself had just suggested was illegal under international law. By endorsing the objective of the war, stopping Iran, Canada has trapped itself regarding the means. As this conflict inevitably drags on past the initial optimistic projections, the United States will formally request Canadian assistance. It may be access to airspace, naval support, or specialized personnel. When that formal request comes, accompanied by the implicit threat of economic tariffs, Ottawa will have absolutely no principled ground left upon which to stand. They have already conceded the righteousness of the cause. To refuse participation later will only invite the full wrath of an American administration that expects absolute loyalty. Canada will find itself militarily entangled, having traded its sovereign identity for a temporary reprieve on a trade deal. This brings us to a deeply uncomfortable question, and I am genuinely curious to read your take on this. If you were sitting in the Prime Minister's chair, staring down the barrel of an economic embargo that could devastate your nation's working class, would you have held the line on international law, or would you have made the exact same compromise? Let me know where you draw the line in the comments below. To truly comprehend the sheer gravitational pull of this trap, we must examine the specific mechanics of the economic coercion at play and the profound structural vulnerabilities of the Canadian state. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement is not merely a trade document. For Canada, it is the central nervous system of its national economy. Consider the Ambassador Bridge connecting Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario. Across this single expanse of steel and concrete, hundreds of millions of dollars in automotive parts and finished vehicles cross every single day. The North American auto industry does not operate on a model of isolated national production. It operates on highly integrated, just-in-time supply chains. A single car part may cross the US-Canada border half a dozen times before the vehicle is finally assembled and sold. If an American president, operating under the transactional doctrine of America First, decides to invoke Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, declaring Canadian auto imports a national security threat as leverage for military compliance, the economic devastation in Ontario would not be measured in years, but in days. Assembly lines would halt. Hundreds of thousands of well-paying manufacturing jobs would evaporate. The vulnerability extends far beyond the industrial heartland. Look to the western provinces, particularly Alberta. Canada's energy sector is almost entirely captive to the United States market. Without sufficient pipeline infrastructure to reach tidewater and global markets, Canadian heavy crude flows overwhelmingly south into the American Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries. A punitive tariff or an executive order limiting cross-border energy flows would instantly plunge the Canadian economy into a deep, agonizing recession. It is a level of structural dependence that leaves Ottawa functionally incapable of executing an entirely independent foreign policy when the stakes in Washington are raised to maximum leverage. This brings us to a terrifying realization about the shifting architecture of Western alliances. For decades following the Second World War, the West operated under a principle of collective security, primarily embodied by NATO. The understanding was that an attack on one was an attack on all, but equally, the alliance provided a buffer against internal coercion. However, what we are witnessing now is the systematic dismantling of this multilateral shield in favor of a hub-and-spoke paradigm. In this new model, the United States places itself firmly at the center, the hub, and interacts with its allies entirely on a bilateral basis, the spokes. By refusing to engage with allies as a collective bloc, the American administration isolates them, forcing each capital to negotiate its compliance individually. When Washington applies pressure to Spain, Madrid can at least turn to Brussels. The European Union, with its massive collective market power, provides a degree of insulation, a buffer against overwhelming American economic coercion. Canada enjoys no such luxury. Geographically and economically, it shares a solitary continent with an unpredictable hegemon. The Canadian Prime Minister stands alone in the crosshairs, acutely aware that there is no international body coming to rescue the Canadian dollar if the President of the United States decides to weaponize the border. But the consequences of Canada's capitulation radiate far beyond the borders of North America. They are being closely monitored in the halls of power across the globe, particularly in Beijing and Moscow. We must ask ourselves, how is this joint statement from Ottawa being interpreted by the world's rising autocratic powers? For years, leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have argued that the rules-based international order is a fiction, a hypocritical construct designed solely to protect American hegemony while keeping emerging powers contained. They have long asserted that when the chips are down, Western democracies care nothing for international law, only for the preservation of their own power and economic comfort. By endorsing an unauthorized unilateral military strike, Canada, historically the loudest, most persistent cheerleader for this rules-based order, has just handed Moscow and Beijing the ultimate propaganda victory. Canada was the Boy Scout of the G7. It was the nation that prided itself on moral clarity, peacekeeping, and the strict adherence to the UN Charter. If even the Boy Scout is willing to abandon his oath and rubber stamp an illegal war simply because he fears economic retaliation from his neighbor, then the rules-based order is officially dead. Imagine the diplomatic consequences the next time the West attempts to condemn territorial aggression. If China makes a kinetic move across the Taiwan Strait, or if Russia seeks to expand its footprint further into Eastern Europe, on what moral or legal grounds will Ottawa or Washington object? If the defense of sovereign borders and the prohibition against the unprovoked use of force only apply to our adversaries, but never to our allies, it is no longer a principle of law, it is merely a weapon of convenience. The normative deterrence that has kept the post-Cold War world relatively stable relies entirely on consistency. Canada's decision to endorse Operation Epic Fury has struck a devastating blow to that consistency, effectively flashing a green light to autocrats who now see that Western principles are entirely negotiable if the price is right. This collapse of moral authority has triggered a profound psychological and political crisis within the Canadian domestic sphere. Back in Ottawa, the geopolitical earthquake has induced a state of complete political paralysis. The Prime Minister finds himself trapped in a merciless electoral calculus. On one side, he faces a progressive base, the very voters who gave him his mandate, who are fiercely anti-war and deeply attached to the mythos of Canada as a benevolent, peacekeeping middle power. For these voters, the Prime Minister's endorsement is an unforgivable betrayal of the national soul. They watch the footage of devastated Middle Eastern cities and see their own government's signature on the bombs. For these voters, the Prime Minister's endorsement is an unforgivable betrayal of the national soul. They watch the footage of devastated Middle Eastern cities and see their own government's signature on the bombs. On the other side, the Prime Minister faces a pragmatic, centrist corporate class that is terrified of a recession. The chambers of commerce, the manufacturing unions, the agricultural lobbies, they understand the brutal reality of the border. They may abhor the war in private, but in public, they are quietly demanding that the Prime Minister do whatever it takes to keep the border open and the trade flowing, even if it means swallowing the bitter pill of American military adventurism. The Conservative opposition is equally trapped in this agonizing dynamic. They are eager to exploit the Prime Minister's weakness and his chaotic messaging, yet they are structurally incapable of offering a coherent alternative. The Conservatives cannot advocate for standing up to the United States and defending international law, because doing so would risk the very trade relationship their corporate donors rely upon. Thus, the entire Canadian political apparatus is frozen, reduced to performing rhetorical gymnastics while quietly hoping the conflict resolves before Washington demands actual Canadian blood and treasure. This domestic paralysis reveals a shattering of the Canadian mythos. For generations, Canadians have comforted themselves with the belief that they are fundamentally different from Americans, more polite, more multilateral, more committed to global peace. But in the cold, unforgiving light of the Iran crisis, that comforting illusion has been stripped away. The public is being forced to confront the brutal, uncomfortable reality of their subordinate status. They are realizing that their much-touted independence is strictly conditional, granted only as long as it does not conflict with the core strategic demands of the American empire. It is a profound crisis of national identity, one that will leave deep, lasting scars on the Canadian psyche long after the current administration has left office. Ultimately, the implications of this crisis extend far beyond Ottawa. They strike at the very survival of Western democratic principles. Friends, the crisis currently unfolding in Ottawa is not an isolated incident, nor is it merely a fascinating case study in Canadian domestic politics. It is a profound microcosm of the new global reality facing the entire Western world. The post-World War II international architecture, the United Nations, the frameworks of international law, The very concept that state sovereignty is inviolable and that the use of force must be multilateral and justified is fundamentally cracking under the weight of a new era of transactional diplomacy. These institutions were built largely with the active participation and intellectual leadership of middle powers like Canada, nations that understood that a world governed by rules rather than raw power was the only way to ensure global stability and their own survival. Today, those rules are being discarded by the very superpowers that helped author them, and the allies of those superpowers are now being forced into a brutal binary dilemma. They must choose either to stand on principle, oppose unilateral and illegal military actions, and subsequently face devastating economic retaliation and diplomatic isolation from their primary security guarantor. Or they must bow to the pressure, endorse the erosion of the international order, and permanently forfeit their moral authority and diplomatic principles. If a nation like Canada, a country whose very identity is synonymous with peacekeeping and international law, cannot summon the courage to say that the unilateral assassination of foreign leaders and the unprovoked bombing of sovereign territory is wrong, simply because the perpetrator is an ally and an economic hegemon, then the concept of international law ceases to exist. It is no longer law. It is merely a set of suggestions applicable only to our enemies, while our friends operate with absolute impunity. This is the great, looming tragedy of our time. We are witnessing not just a shift in foreign policy, but the systemic dismantling of the moral consensus of the West. History will ask which countries stood for something larger than themselves, and which countries simply capitulated to survive. The answer to that question will define the geopolitical landscape for the next generation. I will be reading your comments carefully today. Tell me, when the dust settles, will this moment be remembered as the final fracture of the post-war alliance, or simply a harsh but necessary concession to an unpredictable era? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to reading your insights below.